Cool. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Worldviews. Today we have on Brandan Robertson. Brandon's an author, writer, and podcaster who speaks across the country on topics such as spirituality, justice, and LGBTQ plus inclusion. He currently serves as the pastor of Sunnyside Reformed Church in New York City. Brandon, thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me. It's so good to be here with you.
Cool. Let's go ahead and dive into your religious upbringing. How'd you grow up? How'd that look? Go ahead and walk us through it.
Yeah, so I grew up in a non-religious home to begin with, but at the age of 12 started going to a fundamentalist Baptist church with my neighbors, and it was really there that I had a conversion experience, and kind of the old-fashioned walk down the aisle of the Baptist church and prayed the sinner's prayer. But my life really did change after that, and that encounter with Jesus set me on a path that within a few months, I felt called to be a pastor. And literally from 12 to 33-ish now, I've been on this journey to be a pastor. But of course, my beliefs, my theology have changed a lot since I was 12 years old. And just for a little bit more context, after that fundamentalist church for high school, I ended up in an evangelical kind of middle of the road mega church. And that began to expose me to a little bit more broadness within Christianity. Um, and yeah, that set me up, I really think, on the trajectory to become the progressive Christian that I am today.
Yeah, well, I guess what age were you when it kind of formed from conservative to more progressive?
Yeah, the big things that changed my perspective were really while I was studying at Moody Bible Institute in Chicago. I was there doing a Bible degree and pastoral ministry degree. And Moody is about as conservative as you can get, but you would walk off the campus, and it's in the heart of downtown Chicago. And I constantly would find God in all the places my theology said God was not supposed to be. And so, like for an example, I remember going with some friends to a Roman Catholic cathedral down the road, and we thought that the Catholic Church was a false church preaching a false gospel. And I remember sitting in the service and hearing the priest give his homily, which was so gospel saturated. It sounded like something that could have been preached in an evangelical church. And it was just a moment where my mind started realizing that perhaps the worldview that I'd been given, the set of theology I'd been given, wasn't exactly right. It was a little too exclusive and didn't account for all the ways that God might be working in the world. And that continued to happen in Muslim contexts, that happened in an LGBT inclusive church we ended up exploring. And so that just kind of got me on the journey of wondering if the tradition I was a part of was actually true at the end of the day.
Interesting. Yeah, it's because you also subscribe to universalism, correct?
I do now. Yeah.
And so you totally believe that everyone is saved for the most part.
Yes, absolutely.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess I assume that that wasn't always your belief. Was that more of a in the last 5 years kind of thing, or when did you come to those conclusions?
Strangely enough, while I was at Moody and I was kind of going through my beginning of deconstruction, um, Rob Bell came out with this book called Love Wins, which was really this bombshell in the evangelical world, which was purporting a universalist message. He was saying that no one would end up in hell, and God would redeem everyone. And somehow, and I can't even remember exactly how it worked, but I started a relationship with Rob. And so we started Skype calling and messaging, and he helped me start working through some of that theology. And it was really while I was in college that I started moving towards, at first, what we would call a hopeful universalism, which is we don't know if God's going to save everyone, but we hope God does, to where I am today, which is I'm certain based on the character of God and the teaching of Scripture that everyone will be redeemed in the end.
Really cool. I didn't really talk to universalists, so I'm curious to hear what the defense is for it. Like, I assume it has to be a complete rejection of hell itself because you think that everyone is saved. So, what is the defense for universalism being true?
Yeah, hell's a very complex topic, because first century Jewish people didn't have a concept of hell, and our entire New Testament comes from first century Jewish writers. And so that should raise questions for anyone about how we're reading these texts that come from that culture that didn't have a belief in an eternal hell like Christians now do. Um, and so it first started with like looking at the words Jesus himself used. Conservatives will often say Jesus preached more about hell than he did about heaven. Well, if you look at the word Jesus almost exclusively uses, it's the word Gehenna. And if you look at Gehenna, what that means, it was a literal place. It is a literal place that you can go and visit today outside the old city of Jerusalem, where the ancient pagans who had conquered Jerusalem would sacrifice their children, would do all sorts of idolatrous, wicked pagan acts. And Jesus is using Gehenna as an image of what happens when people stop following the way of God. When you stop loving your neighbor as yourself, when you stop pursuing righteousness, Jesus was saying, you're going to end up like the pagans, bringing destruction to yourself. And then when you zoom out a little bit more, I think there's a lot of writing in Paul. And lots of scholars today would agree that Paul was clearly a universalist. For instance, he writes in Romans, in Adam, all die, which means because of the sin of Adam, all of us are infected by sin. And the next verse is, and in Christ, all will be made alive. And I think it's a weird game that a lot of Christians have to play to say that that first part of what Paul is talking about applies to everyone. But the second part of what Paul is talking about doesn't also apply to everyone. And there are a number of other scriptures I could talk about, but that's just kind of a brief summary of.
Yeah, and I guess to play devil's advocate, what would the point of the gospel be? Like, what are we being saved from, if that's
Yeah.
the case?
Yeah. I mean, well, this is an also interesting thing. I think I'm not saying you're asking it from this vein, but I think the fact that a lot of Christians ask that question, if there's no hell, then why are we saved? A lot of Christians will say, why would we follow Jesus at all if there is no hell? I think that reveals that we're following Jesus for the wrong reasons. If we're following Jesus just to escape punishment and gain reward, that's not true discipleship. That's using Jesus for benefit. Um, the purpose of the gospel is to draw us back into relationship with God, to get us off of the path that leads to destruction and onto the path that leads to abundant life. But I don't think that when Jesus was talking about destruction and life, he was talking about in eternity. I think he was talking about here and now. If you live a life of sin now, you can bring about destruction. And if you live a life following Jesus now, you experience abundant life and life in the fullest. So I think Jesus's view was that he was talking about what was happening in our lives in this world. And the reason we should follow Jesus is because he's true. And when you follow him, you experience abundant life, not because we need God to forgive us and save us from God's own punishment of us, especially because the emphasis of the entire New Testament is that God has grace upon sin. Paul says, where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. And so I think hell's a really dangerous doctrine when it comes to how we understand the nature of God and who God is.
Got it. Okay, we're gonna hop into more of that
Yeah.
theology later, but I'm interested to hear, because you're obviously an LGBTQ member, what do you mind sharing the story about how you first came out?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't actually have a coming out experience, so to speak. I was outed publicly in Time magazine right after I graduated Moody. But essentially, what had happened was over my 4 years in college, I was doing biblical study, specifically on the passages about homosexuality. And what became very clear is as I started reading biblical scholars, the consensus was that the verses that typically condemned homosexuality were not as clear as a lot of Christians think that they are, that there's ambiguity about what the Bible is referring to. And so I was committed to trying to be straight or being celibate. And I did a year of conversion therapy, trying to heal myself of my sexuality. But when I finally graduated, I had gotten a book deal to write about my spiritual journey from conservative to progressive evangelical. But I had also started advocating publicly for civil marriage rights for LGBT people, meaning Christians can say that it's a sin to be gay, and that's fine, but we should support the civil rights of everybody to be married under the law. And because of that, a Time magazine reporter wanted to do a story on that activism. And in the midst of that story, my publisher reached out and said, because of your activism for marriage equality, we can't publish your book anymore. And so the story with Time became about me losing my book deal for supporting marriage equality. And the Time magazine reporter dug around a little bit and talked to folks and realized that I wasn't straight and basically said, I'm going to give you a month to figure out how you want me to talk about you in this story. But then within the next day or within a couple days, the story got released. And the headline was Young Evangelical Leader Loses Book Deal After Coming Out. And I had not come out yet. And so that's literally how my family found out, my church found out, and it launched me into a whole new world.
Wow, what were the, early reactions from your peers and your family with that?
Yeah, I mean, my family's not Christian, and so they were generally supportive, a little confused because it was so abrupt. But I mean, I really did receive a great deal of hatred from mentors, pastors, friends who sent me emails, phone calls, letters in the mail saying that they were disappointed that I had kind of turned my back on the way of Jesus and chose the LGBT lifestyle. At the same time, this group of inclusive Christians that I didn't really know existed popped up around me. And I started finding LGBT inclusive churches. I was in DC at the time. And so lots of folks reached out to me. And I kind of found myself being forced out of my evangelical world, but welcomed very quickly into kind of the affirming and inclusive church world. And that was beautiful.
So you faced more love than hostility, it sounds like.
I think I faced a lot of hostility from the evangelical world, but from the progressive world, there were folks who had had the similar experience of being forced out of their conservative churches, and they were able to relate and empathize to me.
Hmm. Okay, then I wanna hear your thoughts on this because me and my friends have debated this topic, more particularly in the last few months. Homosexuality, do you think it's something that's a learned behavior, or do you think it's innate in us, or some kinda hybrid of both?
I mean, I think the psychology is generally clear that it leans towards innate. Most people that identify as LGBT have whatever we want to call it, the traits, the characteristics, the disposition from a very early age. But there is also psychology that suggests at least some of it is part of the way perhaps that people are raised. Um, I think sexuality and those parts of us are not precise. We don't have a precise understanding of how they emerge in humans, but generally, I would say I do think it's innate. Although some people do have some stories of fluid sexualities or sexualities that morph or change over their lifetimes. And that I think might have something to do with culture or conditioning or experiences. So
Yeah, 'cause have you ever met someone that is choosing that lifestyle just out of, I guess, preference in a way that makes sense?
I've never met somebody who's choosing to be gay out of preference. I've met lots of people who are choosing to be straight, even though they might naturally be inclined to be attracted to the same sex.
Do you find that those people are a lot of the time Christians, I imagine?
A lot of them. There are some folks that, for various reasons, cultural reasons, a lot of times choose to do that, and I support their rights to do that. Although I've also seen a lot of them end up in my office 5 years into their heterosexual marriage, not able to make it work, and so it's I will support anyone in the direction they want to go, as long as they're not trying to heal themselves of sexuality, because I don't think that's possible. But I don't think suppressing or repressing your sexual orientation is actually a beneficial thing in the long term.
Yeah, so that sounds like it's been pretty common then for you, for the experience of people coming to you unhappy in their marriages due to the fact that they actually prefer men over women, or vice versa, depending on gender.
Yeah, I mean, I've counseled people that have been married for 40, 50 years to opposite sex spouse and are coming towards like the end of their life, and they're feeling a lot of regret and feeling just like they haven't lived their true life or been who God created them to be. And it's a really difficult process, but also beautiful in some ways. A lot of these folks who are older, especially, like their wives, for instance, are very supportive of them coming out in later in life, and they end up having a very unique partnership. But it is tragic in some ways to see people who felt like the only option was to go into an opposite sex marriage, which oftentimes is not fair to their spouse either, because lots of times the spouse doesn't know that the person's LGBT. And so, in general, I don't recommend it, but people have made it work before.
Interesting. Because there was that how am I what's her name? Something Perry,
Yeah,
who
Jackie Hill Perry.
Jackie Hill Perry. Okay, she was homosexual before and now she's straight, I guess identifies as that. Do you think it is possible for that to supernaturally go away?
So a question like, is something supernaturally possible? I think is impossible to answer yes or no to, but I mean, when I talk to so-called ex-gays like Jackie Hill Perry, she would not say that she is straight and delivered. She would say she still struggles with same-sex attraction, but is choosing to do what she believes is the biblical thing. Um, and I think that if you're clear about the language, if these ex-gays are saying, I'm choosing not to go with my natural desires, but to do what I think is right according to my beliefs, more power to them. I do think it's a problem when people start saying, I've been delivered of my sexuality, because 90% of the time when I've sat down with those folks, they will still say, I struggle with same sex attraction, which seems to indicate they haven't actually been healed of their sexuality, but are choosing to not engage in it because of their beliefs. And I think those are two very different things.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of comparable to if a man said he was delivered from adult content, because you can be delivered, I guess, from seeking it, but the desire to do so is still within you. I guess that's similar.
Yeah. And so I would wonder about the language of delivered. What does deliver
Yeah,
mean? Yeah.
yeah. Okay. And I'm fascinated by the fact that you've been someone that's debated guys like James White, Jeff Durbin, Sean McDowell, Andrew Wilson. How did you get into the debating experience? I assume it started once you got into Time Magazine. I guess people started reaching out asking to have conversations about the topic of homosexuality as a pastor and how it's where it sits in Christianity and whatnot.
Yeah. I mean, to be clear, actually, I don't like debates, not because of anything about the debate themselves, but because I've learned that debates don't actually change anyone's mind on either direction. But there are a few people that have either been influential in my life or that I have personal relationships with. For instance, uh, Preston Sprinkle and Sean McDowell and Dr. Michael Brown. These are folks that I know personally. We talk offline. And so I'm more willing to engage with them publicly. Uh, James White and Jeff Durbin, I used to follow as a teenager, and so that was like I was more interested in talking to them because they used to be influential in my journey. Um, Andrew Wilson, those are the real conversations that I think, regardless of the arguments, I just think when you have somebody who's a professional debater full time versus somebody who's a pastor who's trying just to share my understanding of something, like I'm not sure that those aren't intended to go anywhere. Like when I'm in a conversation with with Sean McDowell, people who watch that get that we are actually having a dialogue and that there's actually areas that we're trying to work together on. But some of the more intense debates, not sure how helpful they ultimately are. But I do go into that realm sometimes.
Yeah, were you familiar with Andrew's work prior to the debate? Like, did you know what you were getting yourself into?
Not before I was invited to do that. Looked him up and did some research before the debate, of course. But in that particular debate, I was under the impression we were going to be talking about the Bible. I'm a PhD student in the Bible. I've devoted my life to the Bible. I can have a conversation about the Bible. Um, and I think we talked about the Bible for about 5 minutes in the course of a 2-hour debate. And so that was one part that I didn't love, but I also knew there was no chance of winning a debate when you have somebody like Andrew Wilson and an audience of 700,000 people that are all already on Andrew Wilson's team. So my goal in that situation is just to be Christ-like. I didn't think I was going to win anything, but if I could be compassionate and gracious, especially when those folks aren't being gracious, hopefully people can see the fruit of the Spirit and whatever impact that leaves.
Yeah, because I assume then you go into conversations with Sean McDowell and you don't even think of convincing him or his audience that your side is more correct. You were just trying to demonstrate that you were a Christ-like human being.
Not with Sean McDowell. Andrew Wilson, I had no pretense that I was going to quote unquote win that debate. Sean McDowell is not really a debate. Both times I've talked to him publicly have been conversations, not really back and forth debate style. Um, and I do think I do get emails. I did get emails after my most recent conversation with him from people who want to learn more. And I think he's got the same from my side. And so those conversations, I'll call them, feel much more generative because people actually can learn something and actually are interested in learning the other side.
Yeah. Are you interested at all in doing more debates in the future, or do you think you're just trying to keep it more conversational?
Um, Again, I've never really been a debater. I don't have the skills of a conservative debater like so much of conservative YouTube is. There are certain audiences that if I get the chance to speak to, I'll do it because I want to expose those folks to what a real LGBT Christian looks like. But generally, my rule has been to not do that many debates. And so, probably in the past 10 years, I've done like five. So, I'll probably keep that same rhythm in the future.
Okay. Cool. Cool. I'm also interested in hearing because obviously you had pretty fundamentalist views before. Now you're more progressive. What other h- big sort of Christian topics have you changed your mind about?
I mean, what topic haven't I changed my mind about? The big thing is the realization that the conservative Christian view of the Bible itself is the problem on most of the issues from my perspective. And so I think it's pretty objectively clear that the Bible is not inerrant, meaning without error. It's pretty objectively clear that the Bible was not dictated by God. And once you move that pillar of authority out from under conservative Christian theology, pretty much every other question becomes nuanced or different. And so, yeah, like I have no allegiance to orthodoxy, or I'm not trying to align with some creed or standard. I'm trying to ask honest questions, follow the scholarship, follow my own encounter with the Spirit of God, wherever that leads. And often that has led me outside of the bounds of conservative or Orthodox Christianity.
Yeah, and then when it comes to biblical inerrancy, h- do you find it challenging to kind of find the line between like what you accept as truth and what you don't accept?
No, but I do understand a lot of more traditional people ask me, like, it just sounds like you're picking and choosing. That's not at all actually how this works. What we're doing from a progressive or even just from a biblical scholarship standpoint is asking, what is the genre of this text? Most evangelicals believe that the Bible is univocal, meaning there's one voice speaking throughout the entire Bible. It's the same kind of text in every book of the Bible. And therefore, you can read every book in the Bible the exact same way. That's just not true. There are some parts of the Bible that are poetry. There are some parts that are prophecy. There are some parts that are history. Um, Most people would acknowledge there are some parts that are mythological. Um, and that's not a liberal reading into the text. That's literally looking at each book of the Bible and acknowledging the genre that's being written there. Um, and that changes the way you interpret a text. So, for instance, Genesis 1 and 2, in manuscripts going back 3,500 years, it's written as a poem, it's written in poetic structure. So, do you interpret a poem as historical? No, we would never do that with any other poem. But conservative Christians in the last 50 to 100 years have been taught that the entire Bible is the same genre. And so instead of being able to engage Genesis 1 and 2 as poetry, which means metaphor, which means not lining up with scientific fact, they've been forced to make Genesis into a history text. And that's a really tricky space to be because none of the scientific knowledge we have right now aligns with a 6-day created world. And so that puts conservatives in a crisis of faith, right? Yeah, I can go deeper into that, but
Sure. So then I imagine you don't subscribe to the whole Earth is 6,000 years old.
no, I don't think that's what Genesis is trying to communicate. And certainly the scientific evidence doesn't suggest that.
Okay. And how long have you been? Are you like officially a pastor?
Yeah, I'm on my second church that I've pastored. So
Okay. And how long have you been a pastor?
8, 9 years now.
8, 9 years. Okay. What's the difference between a reverend and a pastor? Are those synonymous terms?
Yeah,
Okay.
essentially.
I just never understood that. But for you being a pastor, what is the most challenging part about being a pastor for you?
I mean, it's just being able to meet people where they're at. I think the actual pastoral part of it is the hardest part. The easy stuff is getting up on Sunday and teaching, leading Bible studies, all of that stuff. But being the hands and feet of Christ to people that show up at my office with all sorts of struggles in their lives and trying to meet them and connect them to God for help, healing, whatever they might need. Um, that's a gift, but it's also very difficult and it requires a lot from the pastor, but also a lot of reliance on God because 8 times out of 10, I don't know how to handle the craziness that appears in people's lives. So it's a lot of really just trying to point people to God and get the help that they need from Him.
Okay. And was your first church that you were pastor at also in New York City?
No, that was in San Diego.
San Diego. So you're in California and New York. This might be a challenging one to answer because I don't even know if you'd be able to answer this. What is the, I guess, spiritual climate like currently in New York City?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think it depends on what your perspective is. From my perspective as a progressive Christian, I see a lot of spiritual openness. I see people seeking God in many different ways, and not always through the Christian church. But I do think there's a general desire to be connected to God, a general desire to be connected to spiritual practice. That doesn't mean that churches are full and overflowing in New York. I think it's just the opposite of that. But um, just because people aren't ascribing to institutionalized religion, I don't think that that means that they're not seeking God, seeking spiritual depth. And I have conversations with folks who are not related to my church work at all every single week out in the city, and people open up to me and share with me that they are seeking and searching for depth and meaning in their life.
Yeah. How does, I guess, the Christian culture from San Diego to New York City compare?
I think they're quite similar. I think all the big cities probably are generally pretty similar. People move to all of these major hubs because they have dreams or work or things that they're aspiring to. And what I found, especially as I'm getting older, is when people are going out and pursuing these dreams and goals, very quickly they find that the goal itself is not enough to sustain them. I think a lot of us in our 20s, for instance, think that you get your dream job and life's going to all fall together, or you get married and life's going to fall together. I think a lot of folks in these big cities find out very quickly that they've made it. They're living in the city they want to live in, they're doing the work they want to do, but there's something more that they're missing. And that leads a lot of people into a spiritual search. Whereas in more like suburban or rural areas across our country, I think people just live in a climate where, in general, Christianity is the water everyone swims in. Um, and so it's just easier, kind of as a cultural practice, to be engaged in Christian community. Whereas in cities, I feel like people really have to seek it out and seek out ways to get spiritual nourishment.
That's interesting. How big is your church in New York City?
My church in New York is quite small. We are 50 members. It's a 125-year-old church in Queens, so we're not
Okay.
in the city itself. Uh, but yeah,
Are you the only pastor there?
yeah, and I'm part time there. So
Oh, how does that work?
yeah, I mean, because we're such a small congregation, I'm in there for 15 hours a week, 20 hours a week, and I have a full time job outside of it too. So
Oh, okay. So is your is your full-time job something aside from social media?
I mean, it's a communications job for the Unitarian Universalist Association currently, which is a progressive religious denomination. But yeah.
Okay, okay. Because Unitarianism, that's like, what's the mission of the organization?
So I'm part of what they call the organizing strategy team, which is just the kind of social justice work of this denomination. And so it's not religious, so to speak. It's just more doing things around immigration, making sure that we're empowering congregations across the country to respond to ICE raids and things like that.
Okay. And also, I wanna ask, as a pastor, since you were talking about how much you enjoy teaching, what is your personal favorite Bible story?
Bible story, that's interesting. I think I've fallen in love with the entire book of Acts, which for folks who might not know, it's meant to be a follow-up to the Gospel of Luke. It's the story of what happens after Jesus ascends to heaven and the church begins. And the book of Acts is this beautiful story, chapter after chapter, of God's kingdom expanding to more and more people that nobody expected. And so in Acts, you have people like the Gentiles for the first time being welcomed into the church. You have people like the eunuchs, who I argue are the queer people of the ancient world, being welcomed in. We have people of different races and ethnicities being welcomed in. So I just think it's a fascinating story about how the early Jesus movement was countercultural and was already at the very beginning drawing in unexpected people.
And what do you think is the most underrated Bible story?
That's a good question. Underrated Bible story. I mean, I think, again, I'm going to think in more broad terms. I think the life of the Apostle Paul, I think people only know Paul really because they read his letters, but there's narrative throughout the letters, and there's narrative throughout the book of Acts of Paul going from being this radical anti-Christian persecutor to this man who throughout his whole life is really wrestling with faith. Most people don't recognize that because his letters come across so strong, but this is the same guy who is arguing with Peter and having a knockout, drag out debate with him over whether Gentiles should be included. This is the same guy who's talking about having a thorn in his flesh and not being able to do what he knows he ought to do as a follower of Jesus. And so I just find Paul super relatable. And yeah, I empathize a lot with Paul and see
Mm.
myself in Paul. And I think most Christians can see themselves in his struggle.
Yeah, and what do you think the biggest misconception is about gay Christians or gay pastors in general?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I hear every single day is that most of us just want it to be gay. Therefore, we started changing the Bible, changing the church, changing our beliefs to align with our lifestyle. Um, I don't know. I cannot confidently say I don't know anybody for whom that's the story. The story is almost always that the LGBT Christian is spending years, decades, wrestling, trying to live what the conservative church said is the right way, doing in-depth study. And then the more people study and the more people pursue God, the more they find themselves not being able to align with the conservative view of sexuality and gender. And so most queer Christians are very Christian. They're very devoted to following Jesus. And I just don't think many conservatives have room to even believe that that could be true.
Yeah, because it sounds like you've been asked plenty of times, or it's been assumed to you that you probably wouldn't be an LGBTQ advocate if you were not gay.
I don't think that that's true. I think I would have become a more progressive Christian anyways. And I also think, I mean, again, it was my study of the Bible on these topics and my commitment to wanting to teach what I believe is true based on scholarship that led me to believe that the Bible doesn't condemn loving consensual same-sex relationships. And so I would say most progressive Christian pastors are not LGBT, but almost all of them are LGBT inclusive. Again, not for some liberal agenda, but because they took seriously study of the Bible and they changed their mind.
Yeah, have you had a lot of interactions with, uh, gay Christians or gay pastors overseas and seeing what their experiences have been? 'Cause
Yeah,
I've only understood this whole topic from an American lens.
yeah, I mean, I've had the privilege of doing speaking tours across the United Kingdom, the Netherlands. I've spent a little bit of time working with folks in Mexico. I just recently connected to a couple groups on the African continent. And really all around the world, there are LGBT Christian churches, denominations, networks coming together. And of course, each context is different. Each one has a different kind of struggle. The folks I've talked to in Africa, many of them live in countries where it is punishable by death to be openly gay. And so that's a whole different challenge than folks in the Netherlands, where the laws and the culture are completely inclusive. And so it's much easier for them to create inclusive churches. But in every situation, you still have a very vocal conservative Christian group fighting back against the LGBT Christians. So that's pretty consistent in every country.
Yeah, it makes you, I guess, really thankful to, I guess, be in your lane within America's boundaries because it's a
Yeah,
lot more accepted here, obviously, than a lot of other places in the world.
totally. There are a lot of places where I most certainly would have been thrown in jail and or killed for being religious and gay. And yeah, I mean, that's a sad commentary, I think, on where some of the worst conservative theology, and I'm not saying most conservatives are here, but where a lot of far conservative anti-LGBT Christians can lead to actual death or imprisonments, things like that.
Yeah, and I guess despite your views being contradictory to how a lot of Christians are, you've had interactions, like we've said, with guys like Sean McDowell and more aggressive interactions with guys like Andrew Wilson. How do you think a Christian who sees someone like you as an enemy but wants to love their enemy go about doing it without changing his or her beliefs in the matter?
I just think you look at Jesus. There's this idea of going around and calling people heretics and false prophets. It's not it's not biblical. The people, if you look in the Bible, that are called false teachers are people that are literally exploiting people. So I would make it more akin to prosperity preachers of our current day, who are literally exploiting people for their own personal gain. In the early church, there was a great debate about a lot of different theology, and again, in the Book of Acts, you can see the apostles themselves debating theology. And so, I think the question I always ask to conservatives is, why have you made this a gospel issue? Um, how is disagreement over one area of sexual ethics a determinative factor about whether somebody is truly a Christian or not? Because no creed talks about sexuality, no church council talks about sexuality. Until 50 years ago, no denomination had official stances on sexuality. So we're talking about almost 2,000 years of Christian history where people did have different sexual practices, including people today who, in countries around the world, practice polygamy as Christians, um, or people in the United States who pastors who allowed divorce in their congregations despite that being prohibited. Like, we don't make that an issue of whether those folks are Christians or not. Um, and so it is perplexing to me that we would make this particular issue a determinative factor about whether someone's actually following Jesus or not.
Yeah, I've thought about that too, because I feel like to some degree the sin of homosexuality to me is weighed more than every other sin in the church today.
Sure.
And I don't know exactly if that is an accurate thing to do. I still personally still think it's a sin, but I just don't know if it's something that's supposed to be weighed more than every other sin. For example, I struggle heavily with gluttony, but my gluttonous behaviors, no one really takes it seriously. So it's not really, I guess because it's not something that's taboo from the average Christian lens. But yeah, I always thought that was kind of a fascinating thing there. Um, I had another question here. Where did that go? Oh, so this is more like a prediction type of thing. How do you think Christianity looks in, say, 20, 30, 50 years from now, if you have any predictions there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I could speak for Christianity. I can speak for American Christianity.
Sure.
And I think two things will happen. One, within 10 years, I think a majority of Christians in the United States will not be white. And I think that's going to change a lot of things for the better, I would argue. But I also think that the heatedness around sexuality and gender is not going to remain over the next 50 years. We've seen hot button issues come into the church over the past 100 years in America, become the thing that everybody's fighting about, and then just become a secondary issue later on. And I think we're going to see more churches become more inclusive, but we're also going to see churches just say, this is not a topic we want to debate about, kind of like churches do with divorce. And there will be diversity of belief and thought in some of those churches. But, um, but yeah, I think the shift in the demographics of Christianity from white to multicultural is going to be a real big transformation, and I can't even imagine what that will do, but I think it'll, on the whole, be good.
Yeah, so you think that shift would cause also more progressiveness?
I don't think they're the same, because obviously, by and large, minority or ethnic Christian communities today tend to be more conservative. Um, so I don't think by becoming non-white, by and large, that means all of a sudden everybody's going to be liberal. I actually think there will be lots and lots of conservatives. I just don't think that they're going to make this the center point issue that it is. I was just in a meeting last week with conservative ethnic churches in my community. And I remember this contingent of Black churches stood up and said, "We're tired of talking about this. Can we just focus on something else?" And to me, that's a real indicator that people are like, we're not going to come to a conclusion on this matter. So let's move on to the things that actually are the center point of our faith. And I hope that that's the direction that we go.
Yeah, and when you're in meetings like that with conservative Christians, do you ever feel like you're about to be a target?
No, I mean, our church currently is part of two denominations, and the denomination that I was a part of in this meeting is a non inclusive denomination, the Reformed Church of America. And so while they ordained me and while they allow me to be a pastor, the vast majority of my colleagues don't believe that a gay person can be a pastor. And yet, they found a way to some degree to have tolerance. So it's not like they disregard me or disrespect me when I show up to these meetings. It's just they recognize that my church chose me as their pastor, has a different set of beliefs, but we're still united in the same denomination with the same general goals. And so we can debate this, but it's not going to divide us. And I think it's not a perfect situation. There are plenty of issues, but I haven't up till now felt like a target. I felt like a conversation partner with people who disagree.
Mm, mm. What is, next for you then? Like, what are the things you want to actually, you know what? What's next for you, then what are the things you wanna accomplish overall?
Yeah, I mean, I'm finishing a PhD in biblical studies. I would love to get into a seminary or a graduate school and be teaching theology and Bible to folks. And I'll continue doing pastoral work, both within the church and outside of it. I mean, social media has changed my life in ways I never expected. And I get so much fulfillment out of getting to engage with people all over the world on different topics, not just LGBT issues on social media. And I've also written 10 books over the past 10 years, and I want to keep doing that because writing is how I process my own beliefs. And it's such a rewarding experience to have people engage with my thoughts and then getting to have conversations around that with people. And so I just want to help people feel like they can ask questions about the Christian faith and seek to follow Jesus and the Spirit of God wherever the Spirit leads them. Um, and I think the other thing is just taking all the knowledge that I've been privileged to be exposed to in my master's degree and PhD and bachelor's degree in Bible and making that accessible to the wider public because so many people don't get the chance to go study like I have. So,
Yeah. Do you ever get burnt out on talking about the LGBTQ topic?
yeah, I mean, yes. And I was pretty much done in some regards talking about it 2 years ago and kind of made a decision that I would talk about it if I was asked about it, but it wasn't the focal point of my ministry. And then my publisher asked me to write this next book that's about to come out called Queer and Christian, which in order to write it, I had to enter into this conversation again. And so I'll be talking about this for the next year or two, but um, not the focus of what I do in the world.
Yeah, I wanna know, like, I guess, what do people reach out to you for? Like, what's the second biggest topic people reach out to you for? Or also, what's the second biggest topic you enjoy talking about the most outside of the LGBTQ thing?
Yeah, I mean, I love the Bible and uh, I love helping people understand the Bible and understand what the Bible is. And um, yeah, I mean, I spend a lot of time just going through traditional Christian beliefs about what scripture is and helping people be exposed to different ways of understanding it. Um, and I mean, I started planning like one day in the near future, I want to lead tours to Israel and Greece and things like that and like help people see the Bible come to life because it's a profound book. And I'm really devoted to studying it, to teaching it, and to exploring it with other people. So, yeah,
Yeah, have you been to those locations at all?
I have. Yeah, I love Israel, Palestine. I've been there twice, and Greece, Rome, all the places that the Apostle Paul did ministry. It's just life changing.
Hmm. Have you yourself ever had a supernatural experience?
Of course, yeah. I mean, first and foremost, my salvation experience was a real encounter with Jesus. And then throughout the 20 years now that I've been a Christian, um, I constantly have moments of transcendence, moments where the Spirit of God overwhelms me. Most people don't expect it, but I'm a charismatic. I speak in tongues. I believe in supernatural gifts. And so I experience that quite frequently. And yeah, God is very real and active in my life and world.
All right, talk to me about the tongue stuff. How's it go? How many times have you done it?
Hundreds.
Hundreds.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about tongues is I can't explain it. I don't really think there is a good explanation. There's a lot of debate about what exactly is happening, but it's just a moment where you're in worship or in prayer and you feel completely overwhelmed by what I understand to be the Spirit of God. And a sound begins to emerge that is not you speaking and you don't necessarily understand it. But the sense of connectedness to God in those moments is so deep and so profound that I could never say it was anything other than God. And and I also, I mean, I've been in situations where like tongues have been translated into prophecies that have been profoundly true for my life. And so again, I don't know what's happening exactly. I just know something supernatural is happening, and it draws me closer to Jesus. And so that seems good enough for me.
Interesting. Oh, I just realized too, because we're talking about universalism early in the conversation. So that means you don't believe that Satan exists, right?
That's an interesting question. It's a biblical question. I would say in the Bible, the word Hasatan in Hebrew is not a name of a person, but a general. It means the one who accuses. And so my understanding of Satan is I don't know if Satan's a person like Jesus is, but my understanding of Satan is the voice of accusation, the voice that reminds us that we are guilty or tries to pull us away from God. And I definitely believe that exists. And I've prayed to cast out demons from people in my previous church and things like that. So, like, again, part of my ministry as a pastor is not declaring certainty on things I can't be certain about. I don't know what that supernatural world actually is. I just know that if I encounter something that is not of God, uh, I try to draw people closer to Jesus in those moments, and it usually helps bring peace and healing, deliverance, whatever that might be.
Whoa. Okay, that's interesting. You pray for demons. Do you think ghosts are real?
Uh, I think so, in some way, probably. I don't have any good reasons other than hearing experiences of people that I trust say that they've encountered things, but again, I don't even know how to begin thinking about that theologically.
Where do you stand on aliens?
I'm 100% on aliens.
You're in on aliens.
In on aliens.
Welcome. When did
Yes.
you make that conversion?
Oh man, before
Always believed?
before I became a Christian, yeah, there's nothing more rational and it seems very reasonable that there's something else existing in this infinite universe we find ourselves in.
So you think they're from other planets? Because there's a lot of different, hypothesis to what they are. Some would say other planets, some would say the core of the Earth. I think there is a dimension different dimension people think that they come from.
I'm very interested in
Also
the
yeah,
interdimensional one. Yeah.
because that loops in, I think, with the spiritual aspect of it as well.
Yeah. 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 I think what I would say for certain about aliens, ghosts, demons, angels, all of that is that something else exists and science is beginning to tell us that there's stuff happening around us, dimensions that we exist. I don't know if this is the right language, but within that we cannot perceive. And I think that's just true. And so we should remain open to the mystery of whatever might be happening.
Are you familiar with, Michael Heiser's work?
I've heard that name.
Yeah, he did a book called The Unseen Realm, did another book called The Supernatural, talks a lot about, how much the supernatural realm meets with the natural realm today, as so early days of Christianity as well. It talks about angels, demons, Nephilim, all of the all the stuff in the Bible that we don't talk about enough that is in the Bible.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, he is very fascinating works. Do you engage a lot or actually read a lot of works of conservative Christians?
Uh, Not so much anymore. I mean, I spent the last 10 years mostly, or maybe we'll say 8 years, in conservative Christianity, getting conservative education. And so reading most of the NT Wrights, the D.A. Carsons, the Tim Kellers. But now I actually read a lot of not progressive Christians, but just secular biblical scholars who are trying to do the work, not because they have a religious bias towards it, but just because they're trying to figure out what the history is.
Really? Like, I assume we're talking like Bart Ehrman stuff?
I love Bart Ehrman. I think he does have an agenda. He went to Moody just like me, and um, I think he very clearly is responding and reacting to the conservative church. But there are lots of scholars out there that, like my dear friend in New York City, Dr. Candida Moss, um, is doing some amazing scholarship. Folks will know Dr. Dan McClellan. Um, there's a world out there that is doing biblical scholarship, not because they're trying to justify faith or disprove faith, but just because they're fascinated by the questions of the history of the Bible.
Cool, cool. Well, one question we always ask on the show to our guests is one question you would ask God right now if you knew he'd answer. What is one question you would ask God?
I mean, I think the most fascinating and perplexing question is why God makes it so difficult for all people to perceive that God exists. Why faith, right? There is a world that could exist where God made God's self so clearly present that everyone would know God exists. And it's not out of anger or anything like that. I'm fine with the fact that we have faith, but I just think it's interesting. It's an interesting choice to make people rely on faith rather than obviously revealing God's self for everyone to see.
How long have you wrestled with that? Because I guess that's the whole divine hiddenness argument. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, I feel like as a kid, I thought and I felt God more palpably around the world. Like I lived in a very supernatural world as a young kid. But as I've gotten older, and I hear this from lots of people I counsel, it just feels like, wow, it's harder to perceive God. And it becomes more of a, I have faith that God exists. I cannot prove that God exists. Um, and again, I'm fine with that. And it would just be so much easier if God was very clear and present for everyone to see.
yeah, because I imagine too, since you're a pastor, you've engaged with atheists that pretty much ask you straight up to prove God exists right now, and that's like such a because you're just like, well, I could point to consciousness, I can point to DNA, I can point to all these things, but you can't necessarily say, "Hey, God, can you reveal Himself right now to this person?"
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, even I think there's a problem with like conservative Christian apologetics trying to prove God. Like, I think it's quite clear you cannot prove God. That is what faith is. It is believing in that which you cannot prove objectively. So, on both sides, the atheists and the conservative apologetics, I think we're missing the point. God clearly is hidden to some degree, and God clearly wills that to be the case. And so I don't think we should strive to prove or disprove God. I think it is a matter of faith.
Hmm. Is there any theologians you still wanna have conversations such as these with?
Lots, endless. Over the years, I mean, a conservative that I have a relationship with, that I've had lots of conversations with, but always love more, is N.T. Wright. Um, he's definitely to the right of where I am, but also one of the most brilliant New Testament scholars in the world today. And so I always enjoy engaging with him. But in some strange way, I've been really privileged to get to know most of the people that I admired growing up, and do get to have conversations with people that are way smarter than me that have been in this for way longer, and it's amazing. I really love it.
Mm, mm. Well, Brandon, I appreciate you coming on. Any final words for the audience?
Yeah, I mean, just one of the commands of the New Testament Paul writes is study to show yourself approved unto God. I think part of the call as a Christian of any belief or background is to study, to be open to learning more and not being afraid of wherever the truth leads you, because all truth is God's truth. And so don't be afraid to engage. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to read people that you will disagree with, because that's how we rethink and reform and reshape our worldview and how we live in the world.
Amen. Well, Brandon, I appreciate you coming on. Yeah, thanks again, man. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.